We're going to start the final session of the morning in the next minute or two. So if you could all take your seats, bring a coffee, whatever you need. My name is Chris Hewitt, so I'm the Director of the Climate Services Branch at the World Meteorological Organization, so I will be facilitating or emceeing this session. Apologies for the slight delay. I believe we have people online as well, so welcome to the online audience to this session. There's been a slight change, so we will have the keynote address from Ben Churchill from the WMO. So Celeste Saulo is saving her voice. She will participate in the panel, but Ben will be doing the presentation. So this is an opportunity to do a deep dive into the findings of the State of the Climate reports for Asia and the Southwest Pacific. So for those of you who are unaware, just as a very quick bit of background, so the WMO has been producing global State of the Climate reports since 1993, so going back a very long time, to provide information on climate variability, climate change and extreme events. The initial audience for those reports was primarily WMO members, so the WMO community. But since 2016, the WMO started to formally submit State of the Climate reports to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties, so COP in short. The scientific parts draws on global climate observing system definitions of essential climate variables and climate indicators. And we'll hear a lot more about this from Ben in a minute. And this complements the IPCC's longer-term assessment cycle. So they produce assessment reports every 5, 6 or 7 years, and the WMO State of the Climate reports happen annually. So they provide an annual update on long-term climate trends. So the regional reports, for popular demand, we also now produce regional reports. So in 2019, we started producing a regional State of the Climate report for Africa. And 2020, we then produced a regional report for Asia, a regional report for the Southwest Pacific, and another one for Latin America and the Caribbean. And then from 2021, we've been producing a regional report for Europe. So this session will focus on the regional reports for Asia and Southwest Pacific. So the Asia report was launched several months ago in April, and the Southwest Pacific one was actually launched by the UN Secretary General last week in the Southwest Pacific. So thank you to everyone involved in this. Many of you are in the room and many of you are online, so thank you very much. I mean, it's a huge honour for me. I've been in this job for 2 years and I am so honoured and privileged to have the involvement in these reports, so thank you all very much, genuinely. So this session, the structure, will have a presentation from Ben running through the findings from the Asia report and the Southwest Pacific reports. We'll then have a short video from UNDRR. So this would have been shown last week at the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting, where the UN Secretary General launched the report, but we're taking the opportunity to show it here. And then we will have a panel discussion. So I'll invite the panel members up after we've had the videos. So when you see the video, panel members, please get ready to come up on stage and we will sit up here and have discussion. So, Ben, I would now like to give you the floor to run through the findings from the two reports.
Thank you. Thank you for the height adjustment. Well, thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you, Chris, for the nice introduction. I also want to echo my sincere appreciation and gratitude to, well, the organisation that I work for, WMO, for taking the initiative, our partners in the region, particularly ESCAP, who helped co-author both the Asia and the Southwest Pacific reports, but also the members, because these reports are written by the members for the members. So these are your reports. And I will say, as the Director of the Regional Office for Asia and Southwest Pacific, when this initiative began 4 years ago, it really put WMO and its members on the map, regionally and globally. It is very important to have these reports at hand to have the discussions with your governments and with your stakeholders to really highlight what it is you do and the value that you add by sharing this information. So I am here representing Secretary General, and thank you for the organiser for updating the slide. And I will just walk you through both reports. As mentioned, the Asia report was released in April, and last week the Southwest Pacific was launched in Tonga. But what we haven't here is an opportunity to bring both those reports together, because in the ASEAN context, we have 5 members from Asia and 5 from the Southwest Pacific. So this is the nice nexus, and it could create opportunities for a more ASEAN-focused reporting further down the track. So allow me to start, and I think I can click through the slides. If not, I will click buttons. So just to put this into the global context, well, we all have seen these diagrams before, but the concentrations of the 3 main greenhouse gases continue to climb and have reached new record observed highs in 2022. And just to remind people that these are retrospective reports, so we're looking back over the last year and a little bit beyond. The global annual mean near surface temperature in 2023 was 1.45 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial average. And as we've heard from myself and others, 2023 was the warmest year on record, according to 6 globally averaged data sets. And also this contributed to sea level rise, and that continued to rise in 2023 globally, reaching a new record high. And just to put this into context, the WMO, of course, has its technical commissions and research board that you're aware of, and the regional associations, there are 6 of these, and this focuses on RA2, Asia, Regional Association 2, and Regional Association 5, Southwest Pacific, which collectively cover 59 members. So ASEAN is a subset of both of those regions, and this is just to point out how the regions are organised, but also that we have regional officers and representative officers in the WMO Secretariat supporting members in these regions. So a little bit of a recap on regional state of the climate reports, and perhaps I can pass through this very quickly because Chris highlighted that this is the 4th year that this initiative has continued. But I want to point out on this slide that it is a very big and collective effort from a number of members and contributors. So for Southwest Pacific, the report was written by 42 experts from across not just the region but also the world. We've had collaboration with international regional institutions, including UN agencies, UNDRR, of course I mentioned ESCAP before, and also nominated authors from the WMO membership. And in the Asia context, 54 experts, 6 international organisations and 12 members. So you can see the numbers are really important to describe that it's not just a small number of people. This is a really, a collaborative effort to put these reports together, and it's no small task. So now we will focus sort of alternating between Asia and the Southwest Pacific, and then we'll bring them together so you can compare and contrast. But in 2023, we saw that this was the 2nd warmest year on record in Asia, which was nearly 1 degree Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 reference, and it's warming faster than the global average since 1960. So this has been quite a long trend in Asia, and was almost double in 1991 and 2023 than it was in the 1961 to 1990 trend. So you can see it's quite a steep climb. So in terms of temperature in the Southwest Pacific, by way of comparison, 2023 was substantially warmer than previous several years in Southwest Pacific. And of course this was associated with the transition from La Nina to El Nino conditions. And there seemed to have been a sort of somewhat of a lag effect there. Mean annual temperature over the region for 2023, a little bit less than Asia in terms of the increase, but 0.29 degrees above the 1991-2020 average. So it was one of the 3 warmest years on record. So I think we're sort of nitpicking if we're worrying about which. We're clearly seeing a trend of temperatures increasing. In terms of precipitation in Asia, it had the largest precipitation excesses in southern Pakistan and Northeast Asia as well, and also the Arabian Peninsula, which caught a lot of us by surprise to see some significant rainfall events over Oman and United Arab Emirates. But also in Central Asia, Himalayas, Ganges, there was significant rainfall and flooding and associated hazards there. In Southwest Pacific, which is in contrast more of a maritime continent, it is fair to say, including Australia and the Pacific Islands and New Zealand, from January to April 2023, we saw above average rainfall, which is typical for La Nina. And from September to December, rainfall was below average for much of these regions. In the Central Pacific, where our Secretary General has just visited, start of 2023 saw below average rainfall, but the amount of rainfall in the latter part of the year was above average. And I pointed out yesterday the impacts on our glaciers, not just as a symptom of global warming, but also causing a number of these phenomena in terms of sea level rise, but also very much impacting on things like water security and thereby food security, and also impacting on energy production in some countries. Glaciers in high mountain Asia have lost significant mass over the past 40 years, and this is accelerating. You can see from the graph here that is very clear. In the ASEAN region, we do have glaciers, and in Indonesia there's significant loss there as well. And in 2023 we saw record-breaking high temperatures in drier conditions in eastern Himalayas and Tian Shan, which exacerbated this mass loss. And this also impacts glaciers and snow cover in the Southwest Pacific region. The mountain snow depths in Australia, where I originate from, and also New Zealand, were generally below average. And again, this year we're seeing that trend continuing. And the seasonal peak and melting date of the snow were abnormally early, which is a concern environmentally, but also for the sectors that rely on these areas being covered in snow. Sea level rise, I think the key message here is that it continues to rise at a rate that is above the global mean rate. And so this is a concern for this particular region and also for the members in this room. You can see from the diagram there that it is specific to particular areas, but we can see very clearly the impacts that it would be having on low-lying coastal communities and small island developing states. And it is, of course, strongly influenced by the El Nino Southern Oscillation, especially in the eastern Indian Ocean and also the tropical Pacific Ocean. So that's Asia. Zooming in a little bit on the Southwest Pacific, which includes the Philippines and Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and so on. The level of the sea continued to rise globally in 2023, but it rose at a significantly higher rate in the Southwest Pacific. So it's not the same everywhere, it's not consistent, of course, it depends on a number of factors, but in several parts of Southwest Pacific, the levels continued to rise higher than the global mean, and I think this is the key takeaway from these studies. In terms of sea surface temperature, we can also see that this is warming more than 3 times faster than the global mean. I could probably pass through all these slides and just highlight that we're facing more extreme conditions here in Asia and the Pacific than anywhere else in the world and across the globe. So most of the areas in the Southwest Pacific show this upper ocean, which is 0 to 700 metres warming since 1993. And this generates a big problem for Asia in the context of marine heat waves, which have significant impacts on coral systems, but also on fisheries and other sectors that are dependent on constant and lower ocean temperatures. We're seeing this happen in the Arctic, in the Eastern Arabian Sea, and also the Northern Pacific. And the significant thing is they were long-lasting, in some cases 3 to 5 months. And in the Southwest Pacific, we can see that the most prominent persistent marine heat waves occurred in and around New Zealand, and this lasted about 6 months. So these are much longer than what we have seen in the past, and the emergence of the 2023 El Nino is also visible in evaluation of marine heat waves in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. So here you saw this slide in my presentation yesterday in terms of what's happening. This is just a snapshot of the main phenomenon that are impacting our communities. In terms of reported events, we're seeing a dominance of floods and storms, but we're still also seeing on the other side of the scale the extreme temperatures and heat resulting in wildfires and droughts in some cases. And in other parts of Asia, we have the glacial lake overflow. And this is actually a significant problem. As glaciers are melting, they're putting pressure on the lake system to hold the water, and these phenomena can happen very, very quickly and have devastating impacts. We can see that the death toll there, which is 2,000 for 2023 in Asia, predominantly we're seeing this from floods and storms, but again, other factors are playing out there. And the economic damage is predominantly storm-related. So just having a closer look at some of the extreme events in Asia for now, and then we'll go to the Southwest Pacific shortly, but really characterised by heat waves. I think you will all remember 2023 as one of the hottest years for the region, and these heat waves are longer than ever, hotter than ever, and impacting far more people from a health perspective, but also in terms of economies. So in April and May 2023, there was a major heat wave impacting Southeast Asia. And also in North China, 70% of national meteorological stations exceeded 40 degrees, and 16 stations actually broke temperature records. And we're seeing this again in 2024. And of course, I mentioned drought. On the pie chart, it looked like a minor sort of phenomenon, but it actually had significant impacts on some of our members, not in this necessarily in this community, but in China, the drought intensity is the most significant since 1961, and we need to pay attention to that. And Afghanistan experienced another poor crop season due to substantial reduction in snowmelt, which I mentioned, and also increased rainfall. And up to, or over 15 million Afghanis were estimated to face severe acute food insecurity, which really highlights the link between climate and the vulnerable sectors. Now, I won't spend a lot of time because I covered this slide in my presentation yesterday, but this really does illustrate, it's sort of a very good example of the effect of early warning systems in getting early warnings to people on the ground to drive action, and really highlights the value of anticipatory action. And many of our UN partners are very heavily engaged in this, FAO, World Food Programme, and our partners at Red Cross. But the key thing I wanted to highlight here is that by having the earliest possible warning of an impending natural hazard or disaster, you act early, you save more lives, and you help people get through and recover more quickly. That's the key message from this slide. And in terms of Southwest Pacific affected populations and the ensuing damage, according to the International Disaster Database, the reported natural hazards resulted in over 200 fatalities. So you might recall Asia 2,000, Southwest Pacific 200, a lot fewer, but the population density is a lot lower in Southwest Pacific, which might contribute to that. But again, highlighting floods were the leading cause of death, just over 40%, and drought affected the greatest number of people, 72% in the year 2023. And in Indonesia, in March 2023, a landslide triggered by flooding resulted in 54 fatalities. And another key figure is the number of people displaced. We often focus on the fatalities, but the displacement as a result of climate is also very high. And it also caused the greatest number of fatalities in the Southwest Pacific. So this is really to illustrate the need to understand the link between climate and the complex compound and cascading hazards that can follow. And in 2023 in the Southwest Pacific, recognising this region is particularly prone to disasters associated with hydromet hazards, particularly storms and floods, as we saw in the diagram earlier. These are just some, I won't call them highlights, just to really illustrate how quickly things can develop. And we're seeing things that in the past we might have said these have never happened before, unprecedented. One thing that caught us all by surprise in Hawaii was the wildfire. It came so quickly and was so devastating, literally in a space of a few hours with very little warning, in some cases no warning, people lost their lives. And Typhoon Doksuri in the Philippines, we lost 45. And again, this number of displaced people, I want people to pay particular attention to that, over 300,000. We also learned about, through the report, or recorded, the impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand doesn't often have these sort of scale of phenomenon, and not only was there Gabrielle, there was follow-up weather systems as well, which contributed to even more rainfall, so the ground was already saturated. And so in New Zealand, and I'm was quite shocked by this, to be honest, as in a neighbouring country where I come from, it killed 15 people, and the significant economic damage from that, nearly $9 billion US. And I mentioned already the floods in Indonesia. We had floods in Malaysia with 22,000 people evacuated, and also in Australia, the drought was the country's driest 3-month drought period on record, and Australia's been keeping records since the mid-1800s. So now I wanted to focus on climate services, which is very closely connected to the theme of this forum, to illustrate that we're doing reasonably well in Asia in terms of climate services for disaster risk reduction, but there's more to do. Significant gaps remain in terms of tailored products to inform risk management and so on. So we work very closely with our partners in UNDRR, and we might hear a little bit more about this from Marco Toscano-Rivalta a little bit later on. And in Southwest Pacific, by comparison, you can see there's quite a step jump up in terms of the capability on climate services. But again, the gaps remain, and the services, the tailored services, are actually provided by fewer than 70% of RA5 members. So again, we need to address this. This is probably more Marco's area of expertise than mine, but this is really just to update you on the status of early warning systems in Asia, and we'll look at the Pacific in just a moment. But what's represented here by each of the coloured bars are the different pillars in terms of status. And it's variable, highly variable. Some are reporting very advanced early warning systems all the way through to Afghanistan, Bangladesh on the right-hand side, where we can see high variability in some that are missing altogether. And this is in relation to the Sendai framework. Target G, for those who don't know, is in the Sendai framework as a target for multi-hazard early warning systems. And in the Southwest Pacific, a very similar trend from left to right. You can see quite advanced stages. One thing that might catch you by surprise, it caught me by surprise when I first saw this slide, is that Australia is very, very low on this scale. But I was informed by my expert on services that some countries, developed countries, are actually underreporting because they're very highly critical of their own services. So maybe take this with a grain of salt, but it is information that we can build on nonetheless. So now I just wanted to turn attention, and again, just covering this slide that I talked about yesterday in my presentation on early warnings for all. But I just really wanted to highlight on this slide the importance of working together. The Early Warnings for All is a collaborative effort that brings together the strengths of 3 UN agencies and a non-government agency in terms of the International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, but also other partners. ESCAP, I mentioned before, as a key partner in preparing the State of the Climate reports, is also very much assisting with the effort of Early Warnings for All in countries across Asia and the Pacific, looking at transboundary hazards, looking at funding mechanisms that focus on disaster risk reduction, and also building capacity in impact-based forecasting. And we'll hear a little bit more about that from ESCAP directly. But I will say that the commitment in this region is very, very high, and the cooperation is very effective at the UN level. Of the 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, almost all of them have conducted national consultation workshops on early warning, and I would say almost a half of them have completed their roadmaps, are on track for implementation. The focus now is in the Pacific, and we have a few more to do, but they are coming up on the agenda in the next few months. And in the Pacific, I will say that the key vehicle that they've identified, or a vehicle for implementing early warnings for all is the Weather Ready Pacific program. So a sub-regional collective effort, and this is something we could talk about in the ASEAN community, doing something similar in this region. Also recognising Cambodia and Laos are part of the first 30 countries, and so therefore in the 11 that I mentioned in Asia Pacific. Laos has just recently approved its national roadmap, and I think Cambodia is very, very close. But they're not waiting for the roadmap before continuing under the Cruise initiative. They're receiving a lot of support for capacity building, and they're taking some very big steps forward, and we encourage them to share their experience, and for other countries who are looking for this support to learn from the experience of Cambodia and Laos and join this important initiative. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. To share this information on the climate reports, the regional state of climate reports, is my honour and privilege, and I was very happy to step in and do this on behalf of Celeste Saulo. Secretary General Celeste Saulo will be joining the panel, so you'll hear more from her and her perspectives in just a moment. But I will stop there. I think the next slide is just a QR code for the pigeonhole. If you have questions for the panel, please enter them here. Thank you again very much for your attention. I think we're now going to a video from UNDRR for 3 minutes. So in that time, while you're watching the video, if I could invite the panellists to come and get mic'd up, and we look forward to hearing from you in just a few minutes. Thank you very much again.
Up onto the stage. We have microphones up here for each of you. So I think first of all, you have the honour of sitting next to me, Celeste. So Professor Celeste Saulo, the WMO Secretary General, our guest of honour. And then next we have Dr. Thea Turkington, so the Senior Research Scientist at the Centre for Climate Research here in Singapore, who's been working on developing seasonal and sub-seasonal predictions for Singapore and the maritime continent, and also is one of the authors of the State of the Climate in Southwest Pacific report. Thank you very much. Next we have Dr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta. Hope I've pronounced that okay. Thank you. Chief of the Regional Office for Asia and Pacific of UNDRR, with extensive experience in sustainable development, disaster risk management, humanitarian relief and refugee, internally displaced persons and human rights protection. And finally, we have Mr. Daisuke Maruichi, Economic Affairs Officer at ESCAP. Current responsibilities include capacity building and research in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in the Asia Pacific region. So thank you all very much. So if it's okay, I will start with you. I hope your voice is okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So Celeste, can you tell us how the global and regional state of the climate reports are being received around the world and in the regions? What impact they're having, where you see these reports going, and any experiences you've heard from national state of the climate reports?
Oh, yes, okay. It's not my voice. Well, good morning to everyone. And yes, I think that these state of the climate reports are very well received. And I would say that now are a brand, not only for the WMO, but for the member states and for other agencies that really benefit from this information for decision making and also for raising awareness. So I believe it was a series that started with the state of global climate, and then we moved into regional because we understood that there was a necessity to focus on regional levels, and as we can see, it is important not only because we have the participation of regional experts, and that brings much more visibility to what is being done at the regional levels, but also it brings concrete examples of how each region is being affected. And as we could see and we could tell, the impacts are not the same everywhere. The levels of course, thresholds that are being all the time threatened by the news record. The new records are different. The rates of growth are different. So it's absolutely necessary to go from global to regional. And so it comes to address your question in terms of how important would it be to have national regional climate reports. And for me, that is also quite important because, again, it is a tool for decision making. It's the only way that we can build a case of how our countries are being affected by climate change. And as we all know, of course, IPCC reports are quite relevant, are well known by the international community and by the stakeholders and policymakers at the national levels. But we also know that the IPCC cycle is long, and in between that cycle, every country needs to take action and make decisions, I would say, on a seasonal basis in terms of production, in terms of health, in terms of getting prepared for the next rainy season or whatever situation each country may have to handle. So for me, we are trying to showcase the importance of gathering the information in a way that is actionable and usable by those that are decision makers at the country level. So I'm quite proud of the products we are delivering. I'm also very grateful to all the organizations that contributed, all the experts that have contributed to these particular states of the regional climate reports. And I would commend you all to really engage with these reports and try to build and tailor these reports to your national needs, because it's the only way that our governments will really take this as a priority, and that will help us also to build better informed societies.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind me asking, do you have any initial reactions to how we could perhaps go forward in the future? Is there anything we need to do differently, or in your view and the experiences you've had, are these reports, you said they're a brand now, so they are proving very successful, but is there anything different you can think we should do?
I would say that we would need to have some of the topics that we show should be showcased in exactly the same way, so that they are comparable between regions. Because sometimes, given the comparison is one way to highlight how well or how bad you are doing. So for me, we need to put some, I would say, graphics and some figures that are completely comparable from one to the other. And so we could say, okay, Southeast Asia or Southwestern Pacific is below, on the average, or above the average. Coming from a scientific background, for me, comparing things is so important. So I would really emphasize the need to have some, I would say, flagship figures that we all respect and prepare in exactly the same way, so that we can showcase what's the difference between our region, our country, and that reference, global reference, regional reference, and so on. That is something I would like to see. And I would also like to see more and more the impact and policy making part of the report growing. I know that that is the most difficult part, because it involves social sciences and many other sources of information that are not so easy to access. But I do believe that when it comes to impacts, that makes a difference.
Thank you very much. I mean, my question was a slightly leading question. So for the global reports, we had a big workshop a couple of months ago. We brought the international community together to look forward as to what it is we could do differently in the global reports. And I think we do now need to think, and you've said it in your words, we need to make sure that we're consistent across the regional reports as well. So as I said in the introduction, the global reports have been produced since 1993, but the regional reports are more recent, so the last 4 or 5 years, depending on the region. So yes, there's more work to be done regionally. Thank you very much. So, Thea, over to you now, if that's okay. So can you tell us a bit more about the state of the climate in the Southeast Asia region?
Sure, thanks. And first, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I feel very, very privileged, but also very privileged to be involved in helping with the State of the Climate report for the Southwest Pacific. As we saw from Ben earlier, there's so many people involved, and it's very interesting and very challenging to try to piece this information together and put it in the context for our region. But yes, thank you to everybody that's contributed to the reports. And I guess if I had a message that I wanted to share with everybody, it's the importance to really share your experiences as we are all learning together in this warming world that we experience. So yes, thanks to the Met Services that have contributed to the reports, and I strongly encourage you to continue contributing for the future years as well. Just also before I go to your question, I just want to highlight that again, yeah, it's very important also at the national level to have reports. And just, I think this is useful, again, if we're trying to put this report for the regional one together. And also just for important milestones as we go, move forward in years to come, to remember what happened in each of these years and to mark these changes that we see. Just to share a little bit of experience from Singapore, I'm based in Singapore. I think we started with just a simple climatological report. It doesn't have to be with all the users involved, but yeah, you grow it over time. You start with what you can do. I think this year, our report for last year, for those who are online and weren't here yesterday, Singapore released its 3rd National Climate Change Study earlier this year. So in our annual climate report, we actually compared our observed trends with the projected trends from V3. This is not something we do every year, but you know, it's what we thought would be very interesting to the users in that. But yeah, so I encourage people to continue sharing. You asked about the state of the climate in Southeast Asia, and as Ben highlighted, we actually fit into 2 reports. So we have half the countries are in RA5 and half the countries are in RA2, and there's been a question about whether we should have one for the ASEAN region, and I'm definitely not against that, but because it would be nice to have something all together. But maybe I can just plug that we do have an ASMC bulletin every September we release, which we do talk about the climate, and we also do talk about quite a bit about haze as well, because as I'm sure many of us know, perhaps our seasonal cycles don't nicely fit into the calendar year. We have for the northern half of the region, it's actually their dry season through December, January, February, and that's the wet season for the southern half of the region. So that's why for our other report, we actually shift the cycle slightly so we can get the wet seasons and dry seasons fully in there. But reflecting on 2023, I think it was a really good reminder of how we have an interplay of all these different timescales. So there was a question to you, Chris, yesterday about weather versus climate. And we saw in 2023 this in Southeast Asia that the shift from we had La Nina in the first couple of months, then it ended, and then we had this other El Nino that developed. And we know in the background to all of this, we have these warming temperatures from this long-term warming trend. And so we heard about all those heat waves after the La Nina ended, which tends to have a moderating effect in our region. We heard about all the heat waves, unfortunately, after that La Nina ended. And I don't think it was a surprise to anybody. Unfortunately, all the heat waves, again, that we faced in April and May this year, and will likely be in the report for next year. But thinking back to the topic of climate action, I think in our region we do have this sort of window of opportunity with El Nino events. So when we do see them, we do typically have these warmer conditions at the decay phase. So yeah, that's an opportunity to take action to help mitigate some of the potential impacts.
Thank you very much. Yeah, your comment about having an ASEAN region report is an interesting one. So we'll need to reflect on that. So we have 5 regional reports already, and you're right, the ASEAN region spans across 2 of the WMO regions. So we'll reflect on that. But thank you for that comment. That is useful to hear. Excuse me. That cough just somehow moved down. So Marco, from UNDRR. So if you could perhaps talk us through UNDRR's involvement and contribution in these reports. Is that okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also I would like to thank WMO and ASEAN for having us here. It's quite exciting. I was sharing with Thea, in fact, that I find this report quite amazing in the sense, from a personal perspective, they are really motivating. When you read them, you can really appreciate how much hard work the scientists have put, and at the same time, the type of communication that comes out is simple enough to prompt you thinking and doing. And I think that this, Madam, also touches on your point on the policy aspects. So I really want to commence with that, because it does really help moving the agenda forward. It gives the motivation and the prompt. And for scientific work to that transformation in terms of the way you communicate science is quite amazing. So congratulations to the authors, to WMO, and to my colleagues in ESCAP as well. The hotter findings of the report are certainly chilling, if I can put it in that way. But at the same time, in particular in this region, it's not just doom and gloom. Certainly it's the most disaster region in the world. The reports clearly highlight the challenges and the trends. But at the same time, it's also important to recall there is a region with the extremely powerful economic growth. There is a very vibrant scientific and technological advancement, and I can add more to it. But so to say that the resources that we have here are commensurate to the challenge that we have. The human capital that exists in this region is quite amazing. So it's really important to keep in mind that, because it does help us framing the challenge that we can see in the 2 reports when we speak about the ASEAN region, but at the same time there is a lot that can be done. And I also want to express appreciation for the close partnerships with the colleagues that are working, the ESCAP, WMO, IFRC, and the ITU in advancing the work together. And I will comment on some of the governance elements around this. I also want to, since we're speaking about ASEAN, in my views, in my personal views, has been an extremely visionary region, because already in ADMER, which is the ASEAN agreement, no? You all know in the room, the ASEAN agreement on disaster management and emergency response, already 20 years ago. Next year in July is going to be the 20th anniversary. There is a very sharp article that is about the early warning system, and that sharp article has 4 components, and they're around exactly the four pillars. So it's interesting to see how it has been already framed in an international document of a legal nature, because ADMER is the first international legal agreement on disaster risk reduction that capture the need to frame also from a legal perspective the type of work that we can do. And there is also this very interesting report that ASEAN has done on the strengthening of the early warning system, which I think is an interesting mirror to the reports that WMO and ESCAP has produced, and there's a lot of synergy there that we can explore. Maybe I would like to make just three points on the substance. One is on the risk knowledge. Now, early warning system, I think that despite the challenges, they can be put forward as a, how can I say, as a success story. And we have seen in the context of the progress that has been made in terms of the early warning system for tsunami. If we think about 20 years ago, and again, and in December is going to be the 20th commemoration of the Indian Ocean tsunami, and we see the situation now. There has been a lot of progress, so I think that there is a motivating factor that we can do the same under the early warning for all initiatives and the Weather Ready Pacific that has been put forward. When we look at some of the information that comes from the Sendai Framework Monitor, Ben, thank you very much for your presentation and your prompt. It's interesting because the risk knowledge pillar is the one that is not doing very well. At the same time, is also the one that is moving faster. So again, here a bit of doom and gloom, but at the same time, there is something that is moving that we need to capitalize and keep strengthening. One important element, in my view, that the report has put forward is that variability is becoming increasingly local and localized. What that means is that this is an ongoing challenge for the production of risk knowledge and analytics, but at the same time it is also an opportunity to explore more and more the synergies between local, indigenous and traditional knowledge, as well as science and technology and innovations, and how we can localize science and technology, bringing it closer to communities. And that, of course, goes together with the question of data management, data governance. But this localization of variability brings in a very important dimension, and this interpretation, when it comes to the aspect of compounded and cascading impacts, because in a way, as we were discussing with colleagues a few days back, vulnerability can be geotagged as well as exposure. So that really helps understanding what we need to do extremely locally. And that brings the aspect of inclusion, of course, which is what type of knowledge we have of certain groups, of certain peoples, of certain communities, and how that knowledge is brought together. So the early warning for all initiatives and the work, actually in general, the work on early warning is really helpful in bringing together different type of knowledge. And here we need to couple the amazing work that the Met offices are doing with scientists. Together, Madam, I want to echo what you were saying, Secretary General, on the social sciences to better understand vulnerabilities and to better understand how people work and operate. Second point I want to make is on the governance, but these two last points are going to be very brief. I think that we are facing an interesting challenge from a policy perspective, because on the one side, we know that we have to have much more clarity in terms of roles and responsibilities. The early warning for all is bringing to the fore this challenge on how the four pillars actually needs to hang together. So make sure that the pillars don't remain something separate. But so there is always a tension between the definition of responsibilities on one side, and on the other side the need to bring things together. How to calibrate that is in and of itself quite an interesting challenge from a governance perspective, because then you need to have the flexibility and working modalities to bring sectors together, to bring together, and so on and so forth. Then another related dimension on the governance is how we use these risk informations and translate it and help Ministry of Finance to translate it in the fiscal risk, because that is what can help making the investment for the maintenance of early warning system, for the capital investments, for taking loan for the capital investments, and so on and so forth. And then, let alone the question of the support to local government because of this localization of the challenge. The third and last point that I want to touch upon is on the question of international cooperation, and then comes back into the room and the work of ASEAN. I genuinely believe that the way ASEAN is structured can also help us in advancing in a very comprehensive way in terms of the initiative for the strengthening of the early warning system, because you have all the mechanisms in place that exactly mirror and go beyond also the pillars of the initiative, the different angles. So I think is a great opportunity that we have in working very closely with ASEAN. A number of countries, as Ben was saying, have done the roadmaps, and this is an opportunity for international development partners to come behind and support the important efforts that these countries are putting forward. I'll stop here with the final comments, saying that there is a great variability also within the countries in the region, and that for me is an amazing potential for cooperation and for peer-to-peer, country-to-country support, both within the ASEAN region, but also between ASEAN and the neighboring countries. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. So this panel is excellent. The diversity of experiences and opinions is fantastic. And so it's going to be a similar question to you, Daisuke, in terms of ESCAP. So what is ESCAP's contribution to this report? Do you have any experiences, any I like the success stories example there, so there is doom and gloom in the report, but we are also having some success stories. So please, over to you from ESCAP's perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for WMO, especially for the invitation, and also for the opportunity for ESCAP to co-author this regional State of the Climate report. I think this is the fourth time since its inception, 2020. So we contributed to both Asia and Southwest Pacific report. We basically contributed two parts. One is so basically the landscape of what happened in 2023. As everyone mentioned yesterday, that was the warmest year on record, and we identified it was one of the slides from Ben's presentation, but the storms and floods has been a very prevalent one. And so this basically just highlights the importance of early warning system. This is also covered by Ben's presentation yesterday, but this almost became like our stump speech. It could mitigate the damage by up to 30%, even with the 24-hour warning. That saves billions of dollars worldwide. So that's the first point that we mentioned. And second part actually comes from the excellent report from UNDRR on the status of multi-hazard early warning system 2023. And as also Ben highlights, so I think challenge in both regions is obviously from Pillar 1, disaster risk knowledge. And so I think those 2 points that we contributed just highlights that early warning system is really a key in this region, probably in other regions as well. So, I mean, we obviously present that for us, this is a very good tool for outreach and advocacy. We go to countries that we work with and say, hey, so this is the finding and this is basically the evidence based on which we need to act on, right? So in terms of ESCAP perspective, I think the key message from Professor Saulo from yesterday is that, so what are you going to do with the policy, social science and sectors and stuff like that? So I don't know how many of you guys know, but ESCAP, the first E and S stands for economic and social. So this is exactly our bread and butter, like how we bring in those social science and economic and social implications to all this discussion. So we've been really shifting from what the weather will be to what the weather will do to those sectors. So when we go to those countries, we basically show all those the findings and how Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will be very important. And so that's why our, in terms of technical assistance, our core has been really the impact-based forecasting, which really estimates the impact of those weather and forecasts and in terms of Pillar 1 climate projection to the specific sectors, right? And I think that was one of the World Cafe summary. I think someone mentioned that in terms of impact, obviously one big sector is agriculture in this region. And we've been doing some impact-based forecasting for agriculture production and quantity and stuff like that. But when we talk to those countries, I think there was an example of Cambodia. People are interested in specific crops. You want to know what would happen to rice, what would happen to corns and stuff like that. So I think based on those evidence, we go to those countries and we get their feedback and we try to sort of customize our offerings based on the request. And another thing which I think is quite interesting in terms of Pillar 1 is that, so disaster risk knowledge, if you go into the document of early warning for all, they are specifically mentioning that disaster risk knowledge for vulnerable communities and people as well, right? So it's just, obviously climate projection is a core part of Pillar 1, disaster risk knowledge, but sometimes that's not good enough. And again, we're very much interested in the social impact of it as well. So one thing that we've been doing recently is so-called DIDRR, that's a Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction. So we're talking about what those climate change projections and disaster risks mean to the persons with disabilities in their communities. And if you look at all the value chain of early warning system, it's actually quite interesting. So disaster risk knowledge has to be more tailored to persons with disabilities and their communities. They tend to live in certain areas which might have, different disaster profile and risks. And I think a very interesting one is the communication. So blind person cannot receive certain risk information, which is a very scary thing at the time of crisis. And in terms of Pillar 4, the response and preparedness, I think when we went to Nepal, which is another pilot country for early warning for all, they mentioned that some persons with disabilities have problem reaching shelters at the time of crisis because there's been no plan tailored to persons with disabilities. They don't know who will be reaching out to them to bring them to the shelters and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot on, again, as Professor Saulo mentioned, I think there's a lot of economic and social dimensions that really needs to be taken into consideration into those things. So again, back to your question. So we use this as like one of the evidences that we can show to the countries, and based on which we try to tailor our offerings and projects so that whatever we do really helps people on the ground.
Thank you very much. So I think it's probably time to give everyone else a chance to ask some questions. So the panel are welcome to ask questions as well, but I'll first like to go, oh gosh, there's lots online. So I'd like to go to the floor and online. I'm going to think about time now. We have about 12 minutes before lunch, and that looks like 8 questions possibly online. While I digest those, would anybody in the room like to stand up at the microphone and ask a question? And if not, we will work our way across this list. So give the panel a chance to read these questions as well. Anybody in the room want to go up to the microphone before we go to the questions on Pigeonhole? Okay, I see not. So, first question, what types of engagement have been carried out after the publication of the reports? What engagement strategies have been more successful? Very good question. Would anybody on the panel like to take an answer to that question? Although I think, to be fair, Daisuke, you just started to answer that question. So you said you find these reports very useful as part of the evidence base, if I understood what you were saying. And you also use them for outreach. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so ESCAP is we have 3 pillars of our activities. One is research, technical assistance, and then intergovernmental. So obviously as a UN entity, we organize a lot of meetings. So last year we launched the State of the Climate report, actually one of the regional report, one of the ESCAP's Committee on Disaster Risk Reduction, where we got a lot of audience and got a lot of questions and stuff like that. So we definitely offer platform to launch and discuss all those things and findings. But yeah, I mean, internally, like I mentioned, I think it's a very good thing. It's a good thing to carry and say, we have this report, came from WMO and ESCAP together, and it's, it says something, to the member states. So that's mainly how we utilize the report.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel?
Just to say that in October in Manila, the government will be hosting the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, and clearly this type of reports is what is necessary to get conversations going and focus on concrete challenges and opportunities. So I think it's a very tangible and immediate use of the 2 reports that have been released just this year in the last 4 months. So very, very helpful, I would say. Very, very helpful, especially for this simplified way of communicating our science there.
So I would like to join a little bit the question you did before, Chris, and this question in terms of what we can improve. And I think that we should improve is putting into the reports the quantity of observing system or the quantity of observations that we have available over each region, each country. Why? Because we all know that we have sparse data in many areas of the world. And as we, for example, the IPCC reports show the level of reliability or confidence that you have in one expectation, I think that it is important for decision making to understand that the background to put this climate information is because we have climate data. And so putting how much climate data we have available will help national meteorological and hydrological services to build the case that they need more data and they need more resources to really put more information. So in terms of addressing the first question, it says whether, well, not the first question, the previous first question is just to really take action on how we can improve the capabilities of the Met services to provide more information so that we get better estimates of current climate and, of course, better estimates of projections.
Thank you. I noticed the questions are changing order to make my job slightly more challenging, but thank you for those answers. Building on what Celeste just said as well, so we also produce every year, again for COP, State of Climate Services report, and in there we do clearly identify gaps and observations. You're right, is exactly one of those gaps that's essential, so thank you for that comment and that reminder. I probably should go to the one that has the most votes and try and keep track of which ones. I don't know who's managing this. If they could perhaps remove the one we've dealt with, or perhaps they have just removed that. So the top left on my screen here, how can the private sector further collaborate and support the scientific community to support the initiatives for early warning system and the 4 pillars?
Maybe I can take this one also, and at the same time address the second question afterwards. So I think sometimes as scientists we struggle with sometimes the communication part of this, so getting to that next level. So I completely agree with Celeste that observations are so key, and good quality long-term observations. Just even within the report, so a lot of these figures are, especially rainfall, is produced with like satellite-based data, and it's interesting actually sometimes comparing that with what the countries report, and they don't always agree, so it's so critical. But perhaps the private sector can help with this outreach, communicating, getting these messages out. And so the second question had a suggestion about Google Maps and how we can perhaps like include other information into these systems. I think it's difficult to put a lot of the products that maybe Met Services have already developed. We heard a lot of it yesterday and also today. It's very context specific, what information you share, but yeah, perhaps we could work together to develop products that are perhaps more universally usable.
Thank you. And in terms of the specific questions, so you're endorsing to the private sector to step in and provide more observations, more data sets?
Or in how we communicate the information. I mean, I don't think anyone would say no to more observations, but I think it's really critical that we have these records for long periods of time. I think it's so impressive that we have some of these data sets in some countries. I think in Singapore we have from the 1850s, like, so yeah, 150 years of rainfall records. I mean, this is so invaluable for understanding not only climate change, but also the variability. We're also talking about variability, and so I think, yeah, that's really critical. But yes, we should work together.
Yep, thank you. And on your other point, so we heard yesterday on the panel, I think it was from Malaysia, that they had comments about the sea level rise, and that was based on, I presume that was on gauge data, and in the report we showed satellite data, so that was your point about satellite data. Did anyone else want to comment, please?
Maybe a couple of points also on the private sector, if I may. I think that one of the findings of the midterm review of the Sendai framework, for instance, was the fact that the private sector still does not see resilience and disaster risk reductions as its own business, but rather the government's business. And that is, of course, is quite a challenge. There are, luckily, very important exceptions. And where the strategic entry point is certainly in the applied innovations that the private sector has. We are speaking about, of course, the larger corporations, but at the same time there is also a vibrant dimension in the startups, and there are cases in which startups are brought together with the disaster management agencies. I'm not sure whether it is also happening with the Met services, but having young entrepreneurs being exposed to the challenges that some scientists are trying to address or explain is actually an opportunity to create a new business lines as well, in addition to solutions. So that niche, I think that it has a lot of potentials. And other areas of the private sector, of course, a very strategic one is related to the infrastructure development, and in particular, I would say digital infrastructure when it comes to bring science, technology, innovations, and monitoring closer to the communities, and for the communities to feed back. Thank you.
Just quickly, so for us, private sector actually has been a very important source of data. So in terms of forecasting, we work with Google. Google has something called FlatHub, which actually uses, that's the second question, that they use the Google map format. And they basically have pins of basically stations where they can measure, they can provide a 5-day forecast of floods. So we've been working with Google on that one. And recently, when we went to one of the countries in Asia Pacific, they said, ESCAP, can you help us with the lightning forecast, right? And so what about your hydromet? And they said, all the lightning stations are broken, right? So we had to look for somewhere else for the data sources. And if you do some research, you can find some very interesting companies who are using innovative ways to provide that kind of forecast. So we've been tapping into some of the solutions, that has been found and developed by some of the private sectors. I feel like from ESCAP's perspective, in terms of data sources, I think there's a very big role that the private sector can play.
Just to add, I'm a true believer in co-production, and so I believe that the private sector can work in co-design and co-production with the Met services, with the hydro Met services, and with the academia. So for me, the private sector is not yet there in terms of supporting research or engaging in research, and that is something that we expect from the private sector, because most of the research is driven by the governments, and I would say it's not fair in terms of we all have to embrace risks, and in this case, the private sector should also embrace the risks of investing in research. So for me, there are many things we don't know, and the private sector could be a very, I would say, a game changer if they jump into the research arena together with us to address the issues that are more challenging to this community.
Thank you. I've been getting very polite reminders, which are getting increasingly less polite from the back of the room, that we're running out of time. So I think what I will try and do here is take 3 of these questions at once. I'm looking at you, Thea, I'm so sorry. It's the top left, the one next to that, and the bottom left. Are you able to quickly say anything about the sea surface temperatures in the report? How significant this is? Does it throw off what we know about climate drivers? Can we attribute which portion of the warming trends are due to urbanization, El Nino, or global warming, and why sea level rise is different in different areas? Is that fair for me to ask you all 3 of those? And others are welcome to comment as well, but in the interest of time, we'll try and do all of those at once.
Okay, yeah, I will try, right? Every accomplishment begins with a decision to try. Okay, so yeah, I think going back to my earlier point that we should be sharing experiences because we're all learning together in this warming climate. So something last year that we were actually talking a lot about in the RA5 expert team for climate services was how the warming trends in the ocean are affecting how we monitor El Nino. And we had a lot of discussions, even actually at the ASEAN Climate Outlook Forum that some of you may know about, about how different centers were declaring El Nino at different times. And I think this is part of the fact that these long-term trends are affecting how we monitor things. And so it's important for us to share knowledge that we have or questions that we have with each other so that we can learn together. And so, yeah, I mean, not to, similarly about attribution, these are growing areas of growing research. I know there's various organizations that are starting to deal with this. But of course, with all three of these, also very important is to have those measurements. So yes, we know that sea level rise is not just the expansion, but also how currents change, but also how land movement change. But yeah, I encourage people to keep sharing your questions and sharing your experiences in the coffee breaks of that as we go on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make some closing remarks which hopefully will cover some of these other unanswered questions. I think we've covered most of these. So firstly, thank you very much for all of the questions. That's the most questions I think we've seen in one of these sessions. So thank you to the panel. That was very rich and varied experiences, and thank you again for your contributions to these reports. I was hearing, and you just said it at the end there, but I'd noted down, talking about sharing, collaboration. Also, we're trying to be consistent, so your comment about being consistent across the regional reports, we will be striving for that in the future. And there was one of the questions which has disappeared now about having interactive elements perhaps on websites. So we are thinking about how we can evolve these reports going forward. So thank you for those comments, and please keep giving us comments. We will think a bit more about specifically an ASEAN report. There's quite a large overhead in producing these reports. But if they are of use, then it's something that we can consider. But we can't do reports for every single region, but we will do our best. We heard a lot about the importance of early warning systems and how this links through, and that's been a common theme throughout this forum, so thank you for those comments as well. And again, one of the questions that disappeared was about policymakers and how they act on these. So it's actually going to be a question or a plea to everyone in the room here and everyone online to think about how we can take this sort of information forward to activities such as COP. So with COP29 coming up in, gosh, I guess a couple of months, a lot of the evidence base will be discussed at COP globally and regionally and nationally. So please do think about how you can use this information in your own national and regional activities in your organisations or at a wider scale. So we are at lunchtime. I will stop us here. I would like to ask you all to thank our panellists. That was absolutely excellent. Thank you very much. I don't think there are any more announcements. I think we will now break.